Okay, good morning, everybody. For February 2024, time is 11:38. My apologies for only getting to the voice notes now as we continue our discussion, the disaster relief CERT discussion on the ultimate disaster being war. I would like to take this voice note or two, which is voice note number one, and just respond to a statement and posting, which I'll just very briefly read out. Thank you, Chad, for the brief breakdown on the Geneva Convention rulings on war. With that being said, the inquiry on what process and procedures are in place in times of conflict. I think this stems from the current global landscape of nations in current conflict and the very real possibility of that happening elsewhere. I'd also like to add that these international laws are in place and are often completely disregarded and often with no intervention or restrictions applied. Such a case would be the current Israel-Palestine conflict. My point being, with all the international laws in place, none has been exercised here. So with regards to this, one needs to understand that when we look at the process and procedures with regards to the Geneva Conventions themselves, there is a massive misconception that actually takes place worldwide. And I don't say this in a personal opinion. I say this actually as a matter of fact, whereby the ordinary citizens of countries, especially countries that are involved in conflict and war-torn areas. So I need to build a structure here to outline what is actually on the chessboard. So you've got country A, that's one piece on the board. You've got country B, that's a second piece on the board. But then you've also got other countries that might be supporting country A and supporting country B. In various aspects. It could be in a financial aspect. It could be by supplying military arms and ammunition to a country. It could be in support of other activities. It could be in support of providing aid into the country. So each of these factors that gets plugged into country A and or country B are also considered pieces on the chessboard. And in essence, even though they are not party to the conflict. In other words, country C is supplying arms to country A and country D is supplying arms to country B. C and D are, in actual fact, they could be the best of mates out, to be quite honest with you. The fact is that they are not, in actual fact, at war with each other. So these parties, in this case, country C and country D, are proxies to the war that's taking place in a particular region. I'm not going to go into specific detail with regards to the Israel-Palestinian situation at the moment, and I'm certain most people are in actual fact following it to some degree or another. And of course, you know, news broadcasts are always going to be biased, and it's also always going to be one-sided on this side, and it's going to be one-sided on the other side. And this is why it becomes very important to understand where the neutral and the impartial aspect fits in terms of a humanitarian role in conflict-torn and war-torn areas such as what we are seeing in the Middle East. I will have to do a second a follow-up voice note to continue with this. So let's move on to voice note number 12. Okay, voice note number 12, still the 4th of February, 2024, 11:42. Of course, my name is Chad Marlam, the Director of Disaster Relief CERT, and we are looking at the chess pieces that are on a board in terms of conflict and wars. And countries A and B are at war, but C and D are supporting A and B respectively. They are considered to be proxies. And of course, everybody is, you know, involved. And the end result is that there are two other pieces on the chessboard that are the most crucial pieces at the end of the day. And those are the civilians of countries A and countries B. Now, take note, I haven't referred to any of the militants or the military personnel or those that are involved in the actual combat. They normally are the people that represent the country A and country B, the defense forces of those countries, the armed personnel of those countries. So as far as country A is concerned, we are referring to country A's military as being one of the chess pieces on the board. But now the civilian population is where the problem comes in, because they are also on the chessboard. And when we start looking at the Geneva Conventions and most international humanitarian law rulings and legislation that is available on various levels worldwide, there is a major emphasis that is placed on protecting of the civilians. So when we start looking at these processes and procedures that come into play, a lot of the citizens, due to the personal infliction which they suffer within these war-torn countries, do not understand why this is actually taking place. And I think this is something that happens at the best of times in most situations, where people just don't have an understanding of why certain things are actually taken out or carried out in and around them, whether it be in a war-torn conflict area or whether it be something that happens on a WhatsApp group. For example, I might remove somebody from a WhatsApp group. They don't understand why, and then it's quite an issue, and there's just no understanding as to what the potential risks were being avoided or whatever the case might be. So coming back to countries A and B's citizenry, one needs to understand that the citizens are affected in many ways, not just by being displaced or even becoming refugees because they seek refuge in another country who's not party to the conflict, but they are also subject to being shot, being injured, being having their homes destroyed, being killed in military operations and bombings of the cities and things like that. And there's this massive misunderstanding or lack of understanding, I think, for a better and more appropriate phrase. There's this absolute lack of understanding why they are being subjected to it. And this generates a lot of questions, a lot of statements. It brings about a lot of accusations. It brings a lot of emotion to the surface, etc., which in actual fact can now play into one party's hands or another party's hands in terms of the Geneva Conventions. I think this is a short voice note. I'm going to move over to number 13 and just continue with this emotional side that is brought about as a result of conflict and war. All right, so moving forward, again, the 4th of February, 2024, 11:46. This is Chad Milam. I'm continuing the discussion by Disaster Relief CERT called The Ultimate Disaster War. And of course, now we are looking at what happens with the citizens in countries A and countries B and how they are affected and how their emotions actually bring them to a point due to lack of understanding, lack of knowledge, of not knowing why they are subjected to certain things, like having their homes destroyed, etc. And then all of these accusations come out and they are thrown at one party or another party. And sometimes it's to the advantage of country A or to country B. And the reason this happens is because of the fact that in terms of IHL or international humanitarian law, just a simple example, IHL says that citizens may not be targets of military operations. And this is a massive bone of contention. It has been a massive bone of contention, I think, since way before Henry Dunant started the Red Cross. I think this is something that must have been happening down in the Nordic days and all the rest of it throughout the world, where the following happens. In terms of international humanitarian law today, country A has a legal obligation to notify a city that they are going to bomb the city. They are to provide the citizens of the city the opportunity to evacuate the city and to leave the area. There is nothing in international humanitarian law that says a city or a town or a building or a vehicle may not be shot at, bombed, or otherwise. International humanitarian law makes provision for every single person, building, vehicle, or piece of equipment which is directly involved in the conflict to be considered a target, regardless of what it might be. And if you remember when I spoke about the protection, the protective emblem of the Red Cross movement and Red Crescent, the Red Cross and the Red Crescent or half moon, I said if that is applied to an ambulance, for example, or to a building as a hospital, but one party's military is utilizing it to launch attacks against the other party, then that particular property or building is no longer subject to the provisions of protection under the Geneva Conventions. And it is on this basis that governments of the world, as part of the process and procedures, have to notify the citizens and take all necessary means possible to notify the citizens to leave that particular area in order for it to be bombed. Because ultimately, the military of country A or country B is after the military targets within that area. Unfortunately, there's a couple of things that happen. And we've seen this even in natural disasters like floodings and hurricanes. Katrina, for example, evacuation orders were issued. Many people refused to evacuate their homes and within hours were stranded on roofs. And in times of conflict and war, a lot of people say, this is my home. I'm not leaving it. They don't leave it. And then country B flies a couple of bomber jets over and the person gets killed. So just food for thought as I end this voice note on 13, voice note number 13, and go to voice note number 14. I want to ask you to seriously and realistically ask yourself, who is actually at fault? Who is in the wrong, without placing blame on anybody? Just what do you think about country A, for example, being at fault for bombing a building where the resident refused to leave? Is country A in the wrong, or is the person in the wrong in terms of international humanitarian law? I want to be quite clear in terms of what I'm about to say. The loss of the life of the person who refused is a major loss to family, society, and everything else. There's no question about it. But this is a question of, in terms of international humanitarian law, who is actually at fault? And I think that is something that needs to be considered in the next voice note. Okay, voice note number 14. I almost gave my amateur radio call sign now. It's Chad, 4th of February 2024, 11:52. I'm continuing now with the ultimate disaster war conversation on behalf of Disaster Relief CERT. And the question, the scenario is country A and country B are at war. Country A notifies country B's city, one single city, that they're going to bomb the city and orders an evacuation of the city by the residents. The residents don't leave. Country A flies over, bombs the living daylights out of the city, and a resident gets killed. The question was, who is at fault or who is in the wrong? Who is in the wrong in terms of international humanitarian law? And here's where I want to make a categoric point. Let's say, for example, and this is where communities and residents always misunderstand the law. And they say, but you're not allowed to bomb citizens. Yes, you're not allowed to target them. And if you refuse to evacuate the premises, are you in actual fact not implying that you are part of the militant or combatant side of country B? You see, it could be perceived, the reason that you are there, you could be there as a spotter, a communications expert. Now, country A doesn't know why you are there. They're not in your country per se. They're only flying over your country. And if international humanitarian law had a categoric and specific clause that said, regardless of what happens, that person may not become a target when you bomb that city. That would in actual mean the easiest way to stop a war is to tell everybody to stay in the city. Then country A can't bomb the city at all. And the military objectives will never be met. So is there going to be loss of life? Well, that's the purpose of the act of war. And when we have a look at what actually happens ultimately at the end of the day with regards to the theater of war, I think the question needs to be asked: should residents in actual fact not leave the cities in order to stop a war, which is not prohibited in terms of international humanitarian law? Are those citizens being diligent in terms of what they are doing? Are they being wise? I don't know. These are the questions that people need to ask and people need to seriously consider. So in your personal capacity, let's say, for example, you reside in Joburg and the city of Johannesburg is about to be bombed, and you have been advised to evacuate. What would you do? And that's where a lot of question actually needs to come into play and consideration overall when we in actual fact look at the procedures and the processes. In closing, there's the statement, as I read, that while these international laws are in place and often completely disregarded. Look, we all know we've got laws that say don't drink and drive, don't smack your wives, don't be an idiot and go jumping out of a plane without a parachute, because each one of those has a consequence and a negative consequence. And there's always going to be 1 in 100 or 1 in 10 or 1 in 1,000 that's going to go against the grain. So when it comes to having international humanitarian law disregarded or not considered or not applied, yes, it does happen. It may not be the general consensus of the country or the military as a whole, but there will be individuals that do not follow orders, and they can contravene the conventions and other legislation which is applicable to them. So again, I think as responsible adults, whether we are party to the conflict or whether we are not party to the conflict, and in particular, if we are as one of the consequences or one of the victims of the conflict, I think we still need to be responsible in understanding that there will be breaches of law, there will be stupid acts that take place, but in the general sense of the word, for example, if 10 million people are being targeted and 3 of them accidentally lose their lives, maybe it wouldn't be appropriate to actually say there's a total disregard. Is there a disregard? Yes, there is. And I'm only saying this in order to generate thought processes, in order for us to realize that it's not cut and dry ultimately at the end of the day. Anyway, I'm over my 5-minute mark, so let's move on to voice note number 15. All right, so continuing with voice note number 14, sorry, correction, voice note number 15, 4th of February 2024, 11:59. The next statement that was brought up, can people or nation expect intervention or prepare adequately for worst case scenario where no external help or aid is coming and you are on your own and whatever you have prepared is all you have? With regards to this particular statement, the one thing that I would like to point out before we go into any sort of deep detail of the overall preparedness aspect, I think that communities need to understand that, again, in terms of international humanitarian law, countries have a responsibility to ensure that their citizens are in actual fact taken care of, even if they are forced into evacuations and things like that. And if you go back on my previous voice notes, I specifically covered the subject and the topic regarding civil defense organizations. And of course, civil defense organizations are the legal entity, the entity with a legal persona that would in actual fact be obligated in terms of legislation to ensure that populations are fed, etc., etc. Now, the statement I'm about to make could come across as a rather controversial statement to make, but I would like to express a personal opinion on what happened in Syria, in Yemen, and what's happening at the moment in the Gaza Strip. During each of these wars and the initial outbreak of the wars and the conflicts that were taking place, it's always very difficult for us as outsiders to fully grasp and understand what is actually happening on the ground. Observation, Syria. We saw people grouping together, and that's a civil war. We saw people grouping together, and they were called or termed the white hats, because these chaps that used to go and do these search and rescue operations in the buildings and the damaged areas and recover the injured and recover the bodies would find hard hats, construction hats, and wear them. And it was only after several months, when other countries became sponsors and proxies, that we saw that move switch over from the hard hats into a civil defense organization, and the hard hats started to wear the blue triangle on an orange background as part of the overall organization called civil defense. Now, civil defense's roles are many. It's not only search and rescue and recovery, it's dealing with electrical, fighting of fires, providing medical assistance. It's ensuring they set up food kitchens, soup kitchens, that type of thing, where civil defense becomes responsible ultimately to provide food for the actual nations. Now, here's the contrast. When we go to Yemen, I personally never saw the same type of news media reporting where there was a similar organization to the White Hats to later become a civil defense organization. It was always based on the combatant maneuvering and matters pertaining to the war and nothing else. It was pure military tactics that was reported for many, many years in local media. And now we come to the Gaza Strip. We've seen an exactly sort of reverse effect, in a sense, if I can put it to you that way. And I need to be clear, I cannot categorically state that what I'm about to say is not happening. I'm almost certain it is happening. The question is, how is it happening? So let me put it to you this way. We know that the Northern Conclave has been ordered to evacuate to the south. So we got approximately 1 million people that have had to evacuate to the south. There have been problems. There's been people losing lives. There's all of this. We see on the news. Initially, all of the local ambulance services were running around. But within 6 weeks to 8 weeks, we saw a rebranding of those ambulances to now have the Red Crescent emblem applied to all of the vehicles. So we had a shift where all of the ambulance services were brought together under the auspices of the local Palestinian Red Cross or Red Crescent Society. Let me move over to voice note number 16, my apologies. Voice note number 16, 4th of February 2024, Sunday 12:05. I've just said that during the conflict that's taking place and being carried out in and around the Gaza Strip, during the initial outbreak of the conflict, we saw local ambulance services rushing backwards and forwards and bringing in patients to the various hospitals, etc., etc. And within a 6 to 8 week period, we saw all of those services now starting to have one distinctive branding on their vehicles under the auspices of the Palestinian the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, being the local society of the Gaza Strip. So already you can see the protective emblem had come into play, and all of this was happening. Now, even as I sit and record this audio clip at the moment, we still see these ambulances responding. And we can see that and hear that a lot of people have been displaced and moved into other, they term them refugee camps in the south, and little tent towns and that have been put up. My question is, why is it that we are not seeing the actual humanitarian aid? Yes, I know people are going to say, but no aid is getting in. That may very well be the case, despite the reports, the media reports, that instead of 300 trucks going in, 100 trucks might be going in. So there is some aid going in, and therefore the correct way to ask this question, why are we on the media channels not seeing some aid being provided to the communities through organizations such as what should be the civil defense organizations? And I think this is where a lot more dissemination and a lot more training is required worldwide, especially third world countries, countries that may be subjected to or have be forced into massive limitations on how they can work or operate. And I'm not just talking about the Gaza Strip. I'm talking about virtually the entire Middle East and many of the African nations in particular. We've got similar problems down in Southern Americas. So there is a worldwide problem with regards to this. And we need to train. Look at South Africa. I know that there's questions coming up about whether there's a disaster plan and everything else. And I'm already aware through the poll that's been put out, the majority have already said, no, 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 we're not prepared. And you're right, we're not. And that is the purpose of this type of discussion and trying to keep it neutral and impartial. I go back to Gaza. And I want to say this, I have seen over the last, 4 months, probably 4 or 5 clips where local businesses or local communities, members in those businesses are making a soup or handing out, dishing out bread. But it's not on the scale of a civil defense organization. And I think I'm going to end this session of voice notes for the time being, because I think the next one is going to go into the next session of and grouping of voice notes is probably going to go into the overall preparedness before we finally get to what are the possibilities of us having a world war as a whole. So I hope that at this stage I'm starting to stretch people's imaginations. I hope that people are starting to realize that this is actually not a simple situation that we are dealing with. It is extremely complex. We need extremely well-qualified, well-versed, practical people to, in actual fact, move us forward. And we also need to ensure that as communities, we are properly prepared and trained to be able to assist our families first and then the remainder of our communities. And that is why it is important to get these messages out onto as many WhatsApp groups as possible, to get disaster relief CERT volunteers onto WhatsApp groups throughout the country. And I know a lot of admins on these groups don't want to hear about this. This is not the type of thing for the group. Actually, it is, because these are the things that are going to save lives. And it is up to the individuals on those groups to actually ensure that the administrators do not prevent. And I'm going to make it quite clear. I've been thrown off of several groups because of my vocal awareness creation with regards to disaster in the Constantia Kloof and Surrounds group. And to the administrators that are listening to this, guys, you're doing your community no justice at all. It's actually an injustice, and it's going to cost your community members their lives. And I say to the community itself, if you find yourself on a group where administrators are not prepared to discuss life-saving matters such as this and have professional people attend those groups and participate in those groups, despite the fact that many people will disagree with what is said or what is shared on the groups and might find it silly and stupid and irrelevant, my word to you as a community is quite simple. Leave and exit that group and form a group where you can still have a general community involvement on whatever level, and where the emphasis of saving lives is permitted and allowed. It is highly, I did a report, and I've actually taken this up to the disaster management level, senior, both provincial and municipal. And I have claimed that the action of WhatsApp group administrators, I've coined the phrase closed group syndrome. And in the Constantia Kloof and Surrounds area, Constantia Kloof in particular, where it is estimated we have 4,500 residents, if this group of ours was within that closed group syndrome, we would lose 4,000 or 4,500 members due to, and I'm going to say it outright, if admins don't like it, it's not on me, it's on you. I'm going to make it quite clear. If as an administrator, your attitude is not to have these discussions take place on your groups, I'm sorry, but there is nothing logical or wise. It's ultimately, at the end of the day, pure stupidity, and it will cost group members their lives. So group members, this is a long voice note, but share it with group members and let them be aware of the fact that these are discussions that we need to hold on all groups in order for us to ensure that we save lives moving forward. Okay, I'm going to end this section off on the sessions, and I'll allow further questions after this. Have a good one, everybody. Echo one out. Right, so it is still the 4th of February 2024. The time is now 13:13, and I want to continue with voice note number 7. And in closing, I just want to make mention, in closing on voice 16, I briefly touched the concept as to whether or not nations could expect intervention and prepare adequately. And I think that is a subject that we need to look at a little bit later. So I'm not going to concentrate too much on it as we move forward. But what I do want to do is start leading us up to the question as to whether or not there's a potential risk of a world war taking place. And in order to do that, I think we definitely, firstly, we need to look at two very specific definitions because of the fact that the actual topic of this group, even though I initiated this topic called the ultimate disaster war, based on the question that was posed, as to whether I thought we could expect a world war in the next month, I think there are two very distinct definitions that group members and listeners to this particular discussion need to take cognizance of. And the very first one is the one that defines a disaster. Now, in order to define a disaster, ultimately, we also need to look at the definition of emergency. So, in terms of the normal standards throughout the world, an emergency is a situation whereby assistance is required in a very short space of time, whether that assistance is in the form of medical assistance, fire assistance, or in some cases could even be the requirement to have a locksmith, for example, to open up a property, premises, or vehicle. In vehicles, children can accidentally lock themselves in cars. Babies are forgotten in cars. Animals are forgotten in cars. And that is what an emergency is. And then when we're looking at the medical and fire and other types of emergencies that occur on a daily basis, these are situations whereby the local authorities cope with it. They've got, for example, in South Africa, we've got our provincial government services. We've got our municipal ambulance and fire brigade services that can actually respond and be able to move forward and assist people in need. Then, that being said, we need to look at the definition of disaster. Now, even in terms of the Disaster Management Act, a disaster is any large-scale event whereby the local authority and or the communities are unable to cope with the situation. And that could be something of a natural disaster or even a man-made disaster. For the purposes of this particular discussion, I think we also just need to understand that man-made disasters are things like weather, adverse weather events, tornadoes, hurricanes, etc. But then also looking at things such as earthquakes that can affect us. And of course, these initial primary events or perils can, in actual fact, bring about what's termed cascading events. So, for example, in terms of both the tornado and earthquake and hurricane, or all three, I should say, the result could be buildings collapsing. The result could be gas lines exploding. Fires could be caused, etc. So those are the things that we look at from a natural disaster perspective. But then we can also look at man-made disasters. Now, man-made disasters come in many shapes and sizes. At times, chemical factories, for example, explosive factories, fuel depots can, in actual fact, be cause for a disaster. And I'm not talking about just a simple explosion, but if you take, for example, a chemical factory, which is covering, I don't know, probably 500 square meters, can explode and go up in flames. Well, what are the results of that? So let's move that over, the remainder of this discussion, to voice note number 18, as I've hit the 5-minute limit on the 4th of February at 13:18. Okay, so voice note number 18, 4th of February 2024, 13 hours 18. I'd like to continue with the definition of a disaster, and I'm using a scenario of a chemical factory that, for some unknown reason, may explode in one of the suburbs. Unfortunately, the chemical fallout from that, which could even be a radiation fallout, as we saw during the Fukushima power plant being affected by the earthquake. I think it was in 2017 or thereabout, somewhere around that period, in Japan, or Chernobyl as another one that we could refer to. That fallout could, in actual fact, spread over very large areas of our country. The result of this is that we now find ourselves in a position whereby the local authority is unable to cope of their own accord, or alternatively, the community is also unable to deal with this matter without requiring additional assistance, either in resources, in numbers, equipment, or finances, or anything else along those lines. Now, when we look at our natural and man-made disasters, as I mentioned in one of the previous voice notes, we can see that these type of incidents may affect certain suburbs, parts of provinces, etc., but they don't in actual fact affect the entire country as a whole. Look, an economic disaster could affect the entire country without any doubt. Power outages in South Africa, if we were to experience a total Eskom shutdown, no electricity, the impact in terms of the financial losses is definitely going to affect the entire country. Naturally, that would be considered in this instance, a man-made disaster, but it will in actual fact shut down certain aspects of our livelihoods, but not not shut everything down. In other words, unlike war, it will definitely not bring about building collapses or the destruction of homes, etc., etc. And this is why this topic of the ultimate disaster, war, needs to come to this point of every person understanding that war is the ultimate disaster that any person, any community, and any country can and ever will experience, and must never be taken lightly in any way, form, or manner, and must never be shrugged upon or frowned upon, shrugged at, having people attacked, belittled, or degraded when they raise serious questions of the potential of the existence of war. And I think it's baby cousin, in essence, is civil unrest. I know that a question has been raised. Does the city have an up-to-date disaster plan that encompasses war and mass civil unrest, for example? That being one of the questions. And civil unrest, believe it or not, civil disobedience, civil unrest, and civil war in particular, as I've mentioned, is covered in the Geneva Conventions and is subject to international humanitarian law. So when we are looking at, for example, the July unrest of 2021, I think I've mentioned it before, that was disastrous to the KZN province and to the various communities that were directly affected, not just the businesses and the families who lost their lives or lost their loved ones as a result of the unrest. So one can clearly see that the ultimate disaster that we can experience in any country or by any community is in actual fact war. And I think that there brings us to a point where we now need to shift our focus and actually start concentrating on, firstly, as the question was raised, does the city have an up-to-date or an up-to-date disaster emergency plan? And I think this is something that we now need to investigate as a community, and then finally have a look at what can we actually do about it in order to bring this conversation to a close. So I'm going to move on with voice note number 19 now. This is Chad, Echo 1 out. Okay, Chad back, disaster relief cert discussion, the ultimate disaster war. In the previous voice note number 18, I've actually rounded it up and outlined and explained exactly why the ultimate disaster that any country, community, or person could face is ultimately war. And that, of course, does include civil war in particular. Mass unrest, that is something that will probably be a little bit of a lower scale. However, it still applies, and it is something that should, in actual fact, be concentrated on. From this particular point onwards, I want to concentrate on briefly the question of, does the city, for example, have a up-to-date disaster emergency plan? that encompasses war and mass civil unrest. And there was a further comment that was made, regardless of the fact that the poll is indicating the vast majority of people are of the opinion to the question, and the answer being no. However, there is something that I would like to point out as well, that one of the group members did point out how we fared during COVID and the Joburg Gen fire, the Boksburg fuel explosion, the fires and explosions experienced in the CBD just a couple of weeks back. And all of this is definitely not during a state of war. And fortunately, hats off to the poster, food for thought. Absolutely. So let's address the question as to whether the city has a plan. And I think that the best way of addressing this question is, again, let us begin with the legislative process and tools that are available to emergency management services, disaster management practitioners, disaster relief and assistance, NGOs, etc. And the very first thing we need to understand is the actual structure of the legislation that is in play. So in most cases, during times of war and civil unrest, and even other large-scale events that have a massive or major impact on communities, is we need to look at, we've got a Health Act in South Africa, which deals with how the health professionals in the country need to operate, and that is both on a municipal, a provincial, and a national level. And it incorporates not only municipalities or provincial governments or the national government, but it also incorporates and encompasses how every single private ambulance service, for example, is expected to behave, expected to be trained at what levels, and what the overall expectations on. Then, in terms of the Fire Brigade the Fire Brigade Services Act, this act at this stage actually only covers municipal, provincial, and national services. And in the last couple of years, various private fire services have popped up out of necessity. So I'm definitely not going to shoot them down. But I must admit that I'm not aware of any legislative processes that have been brought through, or amendments that have been brought through in order to cover the private fire services. And without creating any problems or havoc or otherwise, unfortunately, as I say, I'm in no position to stipulate whether these services are now covered in terms of the Fire Brigade Act itself, Services Act. And if there are any of the private service fire operators on the groups or who are monitoring this, perhaps feel free to contact me, Chad Milam, as 082-859-2684, in order to, inform me of what act, what regulations, so that I can be properly informed moving forward in terms of any other discussions. It's a very difficult and sensitive subject that sometimes people don't like to talk about, but I would appreciate some of the input. Okay, let's move on to voice note number 20 now. Okay, so voice note number 20, I'm having a look at the legislative processes and tools that are available to the countries to deal with war, massive unrest, and any large-scale events that are of a disastrous impact. It is the 4th of February 2024, and it is 1329. I've covered the Health Act. I've also covered the Fire Brigade Services Act. And I think even more importantly, besides various other acts, the Electronic Communications and Transmission Act, that will deal with communications, the Critical Infrastructure Act that will deal with critical infrastructure, and that does include, when declared a critical infrastructure, that could include power and water resources, etc., etc. But the final act, and I think this is the most important act when it comes to the actual disaster risk reduction and disaster management overall of disasters, is the actual Disaster Management Act itself. Now, the DMA, as it is known, governs exactly who, what, where, when. It outlines exactly what the minister has to do, what provincial MECs and provincial governments, and what municipal structures have to do, municipal councils, and what has to be put in place and in play. And it's a pretty extensive document overall. Basically, throughout the provisions that have been made and the responsibilities that have been outlined, you've got the outlines for all three levels of government, being national, being provincial, and being on a municipal basis. However, the Disaster Management Act also provides and makes provision for what is called the disaster management framework on a national, provincial, and a government level. And in essence, the disaster management framework is the governing framework in terms of a plan within which each level of government needs to be able to respond. And I know a lot of people, in terms of the question that was put forward, does the city have a plan, a disaster emergency plan? Well, that is something that, in all honesty, is a very, very difficult thing to put together, especially on a micromanaged level. And I say that with the greatest respect to the legislators, the councils, the provinces, and the government, because in essence, let me put it to you this way: the target changes and moves on a daily basis. During the time of writing the Disaster Relief CERT Disaster Area Damage Assessment Manual, which is a manual that's intended to train volunteers on how to do hazard assessments and risk assessments in their respective areas, covering the hazards, identifying the vulnerabilities, and ultimately, at the end of the day, scoring the risk level applicable to any area. These targets change on literally a day-to-day basis. And in order for an actual plan to be put in place, a lot of people are needed in order to do this. Hence the reason for my fellow directors and myself putting together Disaster Relief CERT in order to address this shortfall and to be able to bring our communities to a level whereby they can, in actual fact, make a positive contribution to an overall disaster emergency plan. So that being said, I definitely want to share with the members of this group that there is a disaster management framework that is in play. I will share the City of Johannesburg's disaster management framework document that I have. I don't expect everybody to read it, but you're more than welcome to do so. These plans and frameworks are not very easy to find online. And of course, being a national organization, it does mean that throughout the country, from our director and board level and from the executive management level, we need input from other municipalities and other community members to share this with us. So we'll move on to voice note number 21 now.